Good afternoon, church family. It is Tuesday afternoon, I believe. Uh, just wanted to post today and kind of give you some uh, other things to pray about as well. We need to continue to pray for one another and pray for our youth and children who are at home during this time. Um, it's kind of a different time for them, more so than it is uh, for adults in this way. Um, they're not used to understanding like how to deal with things long term. Like day to day stuff is a lot bigger deal to you the younger you are, and so we need to realize that a lot of us have been through as adults, and the older we get as adults, the more things we've been through that are difficult, the more things we've had to wait out, the more things aren't like falling apart in our mind. Uh, it's a little bit different sometimes when you're a kid. So we want to continue to pray for our children and youth, and just pray that we can help them and be sensitive to that and understand how to minister to them at this time. So today we're going to talk more about the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, and I'm at the office as you can see, which I haven't been doing very much of at all. And one of the things that I don't know a lot of you might struggle with is it doesn't take a lot in my life to cause me to kind of struggle with insomnia a little bit. I've had that problem ever since I don't know, maybe 2009 or 10. So so this is a time when I haven't been out and about as much, and I haven't been as consistently getting as much activity. And because of that, it's easy to not be able to sleep. So I was up all night last night. Decided I'm going to try to get out and about a little bit more, just to the office and back, nowhere else. If you do see me here, just realize that I'm trying still, like everybody's supposed to, I'm still trying to stay away from people, just like you should still try to stay away from people the best we can. So if you do see my car here, just pass by, and I appreciate that. That'll make it easier for me to feel like I'm here without trying to give people permission to just come in and out of the church again. It just makes it a whole lot easier, uh, and I appreciate your respect for that. So we're talking about the evidence again for the resurrection. Yesterday we talked about external evidence for the resurrection. We talked about how those things by themselves do not give us any significant evidence for the resurrection, but together they begin to build a case that when you put with the internal evidence for the resurrection, it gets very, very strong altogether. So the totality of the evidence for the resurrection uh, is very immense. So we're going to talk about today an article by Brian Chilton, and it's 10 Reasons to Accept the Resurrection as Historical Fact. I did post those two videos. Hope you watched them. That was N.T. Wright, and I think that those videos were really short, but they're very solid, very good sources. Both of those sources for those videos were. So today we're going to just talk about some of these arguments, and I'll try to expound on them just a little bit, but I'm going to make this pretty simple. So first of all, there were eyewitnesses to the resurrection, and the first ones were women. And somebody might say, well, I don't know why that matters, or I find that offensive, or something like that. What we need to realize is that in the first century, women were not considered to be people who could testify in court. Now, I know that's ridiculous. I'm not saying it's not. I'm just saying that's the reality of the world then, okay? And so, because of that, if you're going to start a fantasy that you want everybody to accept, if you will, if you're going to start a storybook and you want people to accept this as some kind of credible story, then you would not have started with women as the first eyewitnesses. You would have started with some leader or some patriarch or something like that as eyewitnesses. The fact that it unapologetically in the Gospels gives us this account tells us not only were the women obviously credible, but also that there was no fear in the gospel writers by showing and demonstrating that these women were the first eyewitnesses. When there's no fear in that, that means they really don't care what anybody thinks about it because it's true, and they know writing those who wrote this story down recorded this within beginning to record it within a decade or two after it happened. Then we need to realize something, that if this was not a credible account, then they would have not included eyewitnesses, and they would have not included who they were. These were people you could go ask, okay? So that's pretty big. But the first eyewitnesses were women, and that speaks great volumes to the historicity of it. Then there's the minimal facts argument concerning the resurrection. This is actually Gary Habermas, along with N.T. Wright. I posted the video with Gary Habermas, and I reminded you or informed you, I guess, if you didn't know, that he is the foremost resurrection scholar that we have. So he popularized this minimal facts argument, and it is this: that here are the minimum facts that are accepted by all the New Testament books of the Bible, and that basically all New Testament scholars accept. And here are those minimal facts: that Jesus died by crucifixion, that Jesus is believed, disciples believed that he rose and he appeared to them, that they actually did believe this happened, that the church persecutor Paul was suddenly changed, and had actually even reported having some encounter with Christ. Then also the skeptic James, who's recorded as a skeptic, brother of Jesus, was suddenly changed. Why? Because of the resurrected Christ. And then 5, that the tomb was empty. And all gospel writers are reporting this. This is the testimony of the entire New Testament, but is also the testimony of New Testament scholars who say, well, look, it's here in this book. You may not want to believe the New Testament, but it's certainly reported in the New Testament throughout. Those minimal facts concerning the resurrection are consistently there, and they have been throughout church history considered minimal facts concerning the resurrection. So then there's also the transformation of those first followers of Jesus. A note here is that transformation is always something that we look for in terms of evidence, right? You could say that this could happen in some kind of criminal case. Like, for instance, if somebody's a suspect in a murder, and one of the things they look for is, how did they act when they talk about what happened? How did it affect them, and stuff like that. So we actually use this in criminology, certainly. Well, you could use this in history as well. I mean, what happened, whether it was true or not, would definitely influence what happened next in some kind of way, and it would influence individuals. And we actually see that transformation in the early disciples. It's an interesting thing that the New Testament has no problem, no issue at all reporting that they fled the scene at the Garden of Gethsemane, that Peter was scared and even denied knowing Jesus, and that they initially don't even really understand what happened when there's an empty tomb. Okay, there's no doubt that the gospel writers are including these details, not at all concerned that they're going to conflict with what happens next. What does happen next? They're completely changed. Why? The resurrection of Jesus, not just the empty tomb, but their encounter with him as a resurrected person and his glorified body. They cannot help but be changed by that. So the same men who were in this state in and around the time of the resurrection, once they get around Jesus, things change dramatically when they see his resurrection. And it changed them so much, in fact, that rather than being hidden away or concerned for their lives or whatever. They were right in the thick of the world, spreading the message of a resurrection, not just of Jesus, not just of some teaching, but of the resurrection. When you look at Acts, one of the things that you find is there is a consistent gospel message being proclaimed, and it can be called a charisma or whatever. New Testament scholars will kind of gather what is the basic gospel message that they're sharing through Acts, and it is the death and the resurrection of Christ. And so when you see that, it is the basis of everything they share about Jesus, and their whole faith is transformed because of these things. So that is a good piece of evidence. Then there's also embarrassing details about the resurrection. That kind of almost sounds silly. Like, what are you talking about, Todd? Well, it's kind of like this. Historically speaking, embarrassing details are often the very things that help us to understand whether something's true or not. And it's kind of like this. The fact that the women were the first witnesses, even though other people would have not considered them credible, that would be considered one of these details that would seem to embarrass the testimony, but the New Testament writers are not at all concerned with it. Okay? A member of the Sanhedrin had to give Jesus a proper burial. Nobody else was there to do it. Well, what about this? What about him being the Messiah, having all these followers, this king? But, here we have a Sanhedrin member actually coming out of the darkness into the light and having to risk everything, while everybody but John, as far as we know, as far as his disciples, were everybody but John and Mary and maybe a couple of the other women were at the cross. Everybody else was gone. They were hiding. But here's a guy that showed them this mercy and kindness by giving him a proper burial. And so you have that, and of course, Joseph of Arimathea, who provided the tomb, and also Nicodemus, the Pharisee. Why is that embarrassing? Because it's so it would be like, okay, you want us to believe this is a king. Why aren't you all burying him? Well, because they didn't, because they were scared. But the gospel writer's not afraid of that, because there's more to the story than that. Okay, he resurrected, and that's the answer to that. So when you see certain things like this, the disciples are fearful. The disciples are confused. If you're going to start a story and it's going to be a fantasy, and you want it to be credible right from the beginning, one of the things you do is you make all these things just a good, perfect scenario. But that's not what it is. It's a messy story, because it was a messy moment of history, and it's nothing wrong with saying those things. I think if we ever saw some of the most incredible flashpoints in our history, just as in our history as a nation, for instance. I mean, I would have loved to have read, and probably will want to at some point, more about what happened concerning the dropping of the A-bombs in Japan. I would really want to know some of the agony that they went through. I mean, we'd like to think everybody was just stalwart and said, oh, this is the right thing to do, now we're going to win the war. But there's more to that story than that. If that's all it was, then we'd be reading a fairy tale. There's always more to a story. There's behind the scenes stuff. There's always human emotion. There's always human uncertainty. And the same thing is true regarding the details of Christ's burial and resurrection, simply because of the humanity of the people who were reporting these things, okay? Also, there's a willingness to die for what was known. That's an interesting thing. Now, many people will die for what's not true. That is something we need to recognize. I mean, speaking of World War II, I mean, there were certainly all kinds of Japanese kamikazes, evidently, and some of them would be willing to die. And of course, I would say many of them were simply made to die. But there's always somebody willing to die for some cause. I don't think that by itself is good evidence, but I do think it's good evidence when you couple it with everything else, that these people were willing to die, and they weren't willing to die for an idealism. They actually believed what they had seen and experienced, and they knew to be true, and that was the driving force of it. It's not like, you could actually maybe say at this point, well, you Christians would say maybe you'd be willing to die, but you'd just be willing to die for a life. These guys actually saw this, and they were willing to die, and so it is unique. Also, there's documentary evidence, by the way. This is just a terminology. Documentary evidence for the resurrection is actually very good. So when you look at this, what we want to know when we look at history, especially ancient history, especially 2,000 years old, and I said this yesterday, we need to recognize that if somebody wants us to produce a video, that ain't going to happen. So there's certain things that just can't be produced in order to produce a historicity of something other than evidence. And in every kind of historical pursuit, the evidence that you seek before things like recordings and video and what have you, the things that you seek are written documents, are things that people wrote, both primary and secondary resources, both during the time that this event happened and shortly after. So you want to compile resources like that and comb through them carefully to see if there's enough document evidence for that. And so we do have enough document evidence for that internally, certainly because the entirety of the New Testament is written around a risen Christ. So that is certainly internal document evidence. But you also see that there are secondary sources. In fact, Clement of Rome is someone who was a secondary source. Ignatius, Irenaeus, some of the early fathers who were second, third generation disciples. Some of these guys knew maybe John or like Clement of Rome, we feel like very well did, probably maybe Peter, but also some of these guys would have known second generation disciples at the very least. In other words, they would have known leaders who were trained by the apostles at the very least. So some of the people that were very early and are writing these things are writing this stuff about what has been passed to them, not only in the New Testament document, but by verbal eyewitness accounts of those who saw Jesus. And I even think that it's interesting. 1 Corinthians is basically unapologetic. So you're talking about a book that says, hey, look, man, there's 500 people that Jesus appeared to after he resurrected, and many of them are alive today. What it's doing is go check. Go check. That's a brave document, okay? Because resurrection from the dead, it's not a very believable thing. If somebody was going to think this was nonsense, then here's a dare by the Apostle Paul saying, go check it. Go see him. They'll tell you that he did rise. And so that is the kind of documentary evidence that we are talking about. Okay. We're also talking about some other evidence of this document, and this is what he calls enemy attestation of the resurrection. Historically speaking, if I wanted to prove something, and so what I did was I went and checked the people who believed it and wanted to prove it. They're probably going to tell me exactly what I want to hear. But here's what would be harder. What if I go and check something that's supposed to be true, and here's all these people over here who don't want to believe it and are an enemy of that whole idea, and they are saying, yeah, sure, it happened. Well, that's attestation, and it's incredibly powerful, okay? So enemy attestation of the resurrection. Historically speaking, this is big. When one considers the claims of the authorities that the disciples had stolen the body of Jesus, and this is something Matthew reports, that the authorities thought Jesus' body was stolen. Matthew was written in a day in which those authorities could easily question that. And he didn't care. He wrote it anyway. And it was a published document because, you know what? He wasn't afraid to say it. It could be verified. And therefore it would be seen as true. Well, if the Roman authorities are saying, we don't know what happened to the body, well, we know there's an empty tomb at the very least. We know there's an empty tomb, okay? And so that strengthens this, and also the early belief that the disciples had stolen the body is strengthened, and the discovery of the Nazareth inscription that orders capital punishment for anyone who steals body from a tomb. And also, there's several references to Jesus's resurrection by people who were not Christians, who were not really concerned about the movement, but still reported certain things, like Josephus, like Tacitus, like Philo. Some of these people that would have been around in the era of and just following, they're writing things, and if this was all nonsense, they would have either not included it at all because it was just one more fairy tale. They didn't have time to write every fairy tale down, or this is what was commonly thought at the time, and they know that, and to write differently would make them a less than reliable historian, and that's not what they wanted. They wanted people to consider them credible. And it's interesting that people like this, so what they do, they wrote about what they had seen or heard had happened with Jesus, and that was his resurrection. So those people are reporting such things. So we actually even have 6 external sources very, very close to the time of the resurrection that have no good feelings about the Christian movement, who reported, yeah, this Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate, and evidently he rose from the dead, and he appeared to his followers. So now they're not saying that this is verifiably true. They're reporting it, and they're not refuting it, though. So that's immense. If they're reporting it and they're not trying to refute it, then there's no way they have to refute it, or they would. But it's unmistakably influential in the moment because they record it anyway. So they couldn't ignore it. They couldn't just gloss over it. That's incredibly strong attestation. There's also what's called a missing motive thing, okay? So J. Warner Wallace noted that there is this idea that people would say, well, there's a conspiracy that was formed by the disciples of Jesus, and that's where all this came from. Well, the problem with saying that is that if they were going to form a conspiracy, this would not have been the one. And how do we know that? Here's how we know it, okay? They are men who were primarily Jews who basically had this messianic understanding of a king who would come, reign militarily, remain on the throne, would reign earthly over a new order wherein Israel would be autonomous once again, away from all rule except their messianic king who was sent from God. And that is a conspiracy that men like this would have written about. We have somebody like Simon the Zealot who would have went to war for such an idea as that. He's one of the disciples, and he's one of them attesting to what's happened, and he's not using that because it wasn't true. In other words, if they're going to have a motive for any kind of a fabrication of a tale, this would not have been the tale they came up with. And because of that, that's, again, very, very sound, okay? And there's one more that we have here, and that's this multiple post-resurrection eyewitnesses. Again, we actually have many of them who were reported by name. Then you have, of course, like the more than 500 that were reported in 1 Corinthians 15. You have the Roman guards who, it doesn't name them, but those men, and they might have died. They might have been killed over this. I don't know. But I'll tell you what, if they were killed over it, it would have been it'd be interesting to see that in history. If you don't see it, it's not surprising at all. Rome's not going to advertise that. I mean, that's not something they want in their renting annals, right? That they let some dead Jew from Galilee escape a tomb. So we also have people, of course, that were eyewitness accounts on the road to Emmaus. all the apostles, the disciples, and evidently even Paul witnesses the presence of the resurrected Christ on the road to Damascus. So when you see all of these things together, then what we do is we add those things to the external evidence that we had yesterday, like the number of people and of the stature of people who were so rational, so brilliant, who had such a position in life, and they believed in the resurrection. That for 2,000 years also, that we've had people in this way. And for 2,000 years, we've had a consistency of a belief in a resurrection that was historical, and that even in today, post-enlightenment, post-modernity, we still do not have anybody leveling a good argument to come against this in such a way as to just basically call it a faulty, silly, nonsensical fairy tale. There's never been a consistent or even real existent effective argument against the resurrection, because here you have to either be there so that you know it didn't happen and have eyewitnesses to that, or if you don't, then you have to have eyewitnesses to what did happen. And all the eyewitnesses say it did happen. Everybody, even who don't want to think that is true, is saying all of these people say they're eyewitnesses to saying this happened. I mean, when you get all this stuff and you put all this together, you start to realize that there's an incredible amount of evidence. This is 2,000-year-old history. If you don't believe this, then you're not going to believe anything that happened that is commonly accepted just happened 200 or 300 years ago, okay? Because we didn't have any better history records or any better attestation of a historical events from 300 years ago than we do for this. And so if you're going to believe those things from the way that we can compile history that is old, then you have to say this has a great deal of evidence for it. And again, there's always silly arguments leveled against it. The most interesting thing is no argument says, well, this just didn't happen and this is all a fairy tale. No, all of them that have been leveled against the resurrection have been stated in this way. Well, okay, so clearly all these people thought he rose from the dead. But here's what here's probably what actually happened. Like, for instance, the swoon theory, that Jesus wasn't dead on the cross, that in fact that he somehow just passed out in his emaciated state, and he was buried and then kind of woke up. Well, that's just not even plausible. That would have not happened under Roman execution, and it wouldn't happen. If you're saying that, you're accepting the fact that he went to the cross and all these things happened to him all the way to that point and on the cross. And there's no way that even if you were to be able to pass out and fake your death, even if that was just made up, that they pierced his side and fluid came out and blood, even if that were the case, then you couldn't survive that by being buried up and wrapped up in a cloth full of 75 pounds worth of aloe and spices and left in a dark cave overnight. Okay, that's not the way to come out of a coma, right? So the swoon theory, I mean, it's just silly. It's implausible to the highest degree. Another implausible theory is the hallucination theory. And this one gets me, okay? So the people who level the argument against the resurrection being historical by the hallucination theory will say this, that all the disciples, they just thought it was Jesus. They just thought they saw Jesus. Somebody or some of them did at some point. So they all just kind of got it in their head. It became a little bit of a psychosis with them. The insanity of thinking that could happen. There's nothing that seems to be irrational about them or their behavior after this, except that they believe this is true. But moreover, you got to realize, like, to believe that all these guys could just hallucinate this and all these 500 people, all of them at the same time fall under the same psychosis, but you're going to accept all the rest of it as fact. That's just silly. There's no worse argument that can be leveled than that. That's just, it doesn't work out. And no thinking person would ever believe that. Okay, that's why those arguments that they haven't been effective at all, because they're just not plausible. They can't explain it, not rationally, not at all. The only thing rationally that can explain it is that indeed that the disciples and a whole lot of other people not only found an empty tomb, but they experienced what they believed was Jesus in a resurrected body, and so many people did at the time that even enemies of the movement did not dispute it. So that's what's rational. That's what's rational. So I do love that we can kind of put this together. And believe me, it gets a lot deeper than this. I mean, this is just a little skim off the top of how much we could talk about regarding the history of the resurrection. Now, some of you may say, well, I believe the resurrection is true anyway, so why would I worry about all this? Well, because if it's true, then why aren't we talking about the truth of it? Not just what it does for us in our life. Why aren't we talking about it as facts of history? And if you're going to talk about it as history, you have to be able to defend that it's history. So I don't think there's any reason not to study this to a little bit of a degree at least, to get a basic good foothold on it, and be able to explain this to people and defend it. At least at the most fundamental level. And I'm going to tell you this, by the way, you already have, if you've listened to our series all the way through this apologetics lecture, you already have a better fundamental argument for anything we've talked about than 90% of people who you're going to talk to. And that's just a fact. And it's scary sometimes to think that Christians are afraid to talk about these things in their witnessing and everything else. Maybe they're afraid, and we should be careful about how deep we get into something because of sometimes just not knowing as much as we'd like to. But the reality is, most people that argue against this are just completely misinformed or underinformed about it. They've never heard some of the things that we've talked about. They've never read about it to any degree. If they did read about it, it was just simply maybe from somebody angry with an axe to grind about it. And so what they haven't done is they haven't seriously examined it. So a couple of people have written about this. Gary Habermas's book on the resurrection of Christ. I've got it. I don't think I have it with me. Hang on just a minute. I think I might have it with me. Yeah, here it is. So Gary Habermas's book, The Case for the Resurrection of Christ. Okay, this is not The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel, a different book. This is The Case for the Resurrection of Christ. So Lee Strobel, the difference in Lee Strobel and Gary Habermas is Lee Strobel's not a scholar and an expert. Lee Strobel has to go to scholars and experts and compile what they say and kind of report that. This is going to a first-hand source that is a scholar who can write all about this one subject easily, and has done so with a great. He's just got a great corpus of work on this. So this is Gary Habermas. Also another person, again, N.T. Wright has one. It's a lot more I think difficult to read, in that N.T. Wright is a British intellectual, so he does write a little differently, and it takes a little while to get used to reading him. So because of just the difference in writing styles, I think Gary Habermas would be an easier read. Neither one of them are essential that you need to read in any kind of way. I think just be aware of the arguments. But if you do want good resources, those two right there are really, really good, and those are at top level. Like that's as good as it gets type stuff. I think Craig Evans has some things out there. I know William Lane Craig has talked about this a lot, although I wouldn't, and he's a brilliant philosopher. I wouldn't consider him a resurrection expert by no means, but Habermas and Wright and Evans would be. So that's just some ideas for you, and hope you've enjoyed talking about evidence. What we'll move to next is the old apologetic concern, like is Jesus the only way? Is he the only way that anyone can get to heaven? What's the difference if I believe in God in some kind of way and just don't understand everything about Jesus, isn't that okay? Or what if this Jewish people out here, I mean, they believe in God. We have Jewish roots in our religion. So what about them? We have these questions that are asked, and I think we can answer those very, very simply. And so that is what we'll be talking about for the next couple days anyway. So y'all have a good afternoon. Don't forget to pray for one another. We love you. I posted the Bible questions for the day. And so let me know if you need any help with that. All right. Y'all have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.